All right, beautiful. There we go. My boom arm here broke a while ago, so like the
Oh
microphone
no.
just like falls. Yeah, I was playing with it one day, and then this metal piece shot out of the little hinge here and like clear shot across the room. Like, oh, that can't be good. And ever since then, the boom arm has failed to function appropriately, which is a real bummer.
Now you
But,
get to be one of those
Dr. Mikey
fancy
Nelson.
people holding the mic. Hi.
I know. Welcome back.
Yeah,
Welcome
thank
back.
you for having me back. I really appreciate it. I must have not
You're
screwed
very
up too
welcome.
bad in the last ones.
All good. Yeah. I am excited for today because I think the topic at hand is something that I have a very big interest in, both personally, intellectually, etc. Because I think that really what we're going to be talking about today is this concept of making less fragile, more robust humans through the lens of metabolic flexibility, right? Because I think if we think about fragility as a concept, a lot of times that fragility comes back to there's not enough variability in the system. And I think that you can apply that to very different levels of the system. But regardless of where you look, usually if there's very low amounts of variability and options for the system to deal with and manage and handle stress and problems, that's not a good thing.
Correct.
So I'm excited today to dive into metabolic flexibility, chat about like what does that even mean, right? What does that look like in the real world? What are some ways that we can, work on that and try to have the most optimal, we'll air quote metabolic flexibility possible. So I'll punt to you here. Maybe let's just start with like what in the world is metabolic flexibility?
Yeah, so before I give the definition, I'll give you an example of exactly what you were saying in case people are like, variability, what are these people even freaking talking about? Because in the fitness world, right, the assumption is the higher quality nutrition you do, the more perfect, quote unquote, you do, things will get better. And there is a lot of truth to that statement, right? I mean, eating protein is going to help. Eating vegetables are going to help. But if you take that to the nth degree, you can actually start to become almost a little bit too fragile. So the extreme example that I use is, so some of the special forces people I've worked with or people who are going through the selection process, I get super nervous when they come in with like, they've weighed their broccoli. They've done everything like humanly possible to hit these optimal targets. And so I talk to them like, okay, if your goal is to pass selection, this might be okay and it's probably a good start. However, realize that whatever selection, ranger school, whatever you're doing, their whole goal is just to mess you up, right? Their whole goal is to make sure you have no predictability. Like you don't know what food you're going to eat. Probably don't even know where you're going to be. Sometimes you don't even know for how long. And if your body is accustomed to this very, very small, almost non-existing variability, you're screwed, right? And so one of the kids early I worked on with, he's like, no, you're an idiot. You're full of crap. I'm just going to do it my way. And he, didn't opt to sign on for the program. I'm like, cool, whatever. Just let me know how it goes. He's like, yeah, he made it to day 2. And he was one of these people where if he missed a meal, like he was a disaster. Like he was convinced he couldn't train. He wasn't going to make it. Like he just felt horrible. And oddly enough, the people who do better are people who have, pretty decent nutrition. But if they could go 24 hours without eating, they're like, cool, man, I've already done that. I've practiced it. I'm sure I'll be good. No worries. Or eating, different objects, eating God knows whatever they serve you. Right, they're much more metabolically flexible to whatever is coming in. And another story related to that, I was talking to a good buddy who was in military police in a foreign country for quite a while. So him and a few buddies got sent over there early ahead of time. And I asked him, I said, well, how did it go? He's like, for me, it was great. He's like, I was eating off of food vendors and whatever else I could find. He's like, I had no problem. And he, we had this discussion about metabolic flexibility, God, probably 14 years ago, and he was kind of the first guy who just took the concept and ran with it. I said, well, how did the other 5 people go for them? He's like, horrible. Like 3 of them never made it out of the bathroom the first 2 days. Because their nutrition was almost like too perfect, like too clean. So the idea of metabolic flexibility is there's 3 components. One, if we look at the 2 main fuel systems your body uses, they're going to be carbohydrates and then fat. So how well on one end, let's say the right end of the spectrum, to use carbohydrates? How well can you sort of downregulate and use fat as a fuel source, which could be dietary fat, could be your own body fat. And then 3 is how fast can you switch back and forth between the two? And the idea is to upregulate all 3 of those systems. And when you do that, that allows you a lot more variability in day-to-day life. This variability could be in terms of food quality, timing, response, amounts, which we'll get into your rice cake experiment, I'm sure. And to me, you're much more robust and you're much better able to handle whatever environment you're going to be put in. And by all means, if you can control your environment, I think that's great, and that's definitely a starting point. But then I also think for clients, especially higher level athletes, how can we make their system literally more robust that they don't have to have a perfect environment all the time? Because the reality is that's life, right? Even if you're not a high level athlete, you're probably going to end up at your nephew's, birthday party. And if a piece of birthday cake sends you over the edge, it's going to be a little bit harder to deal in that environment. You have to rely more on willpower. And I think you're setting the system up for a greater chance of failure at that point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think a really good book in this realm that's not related to physiology, but to the overarching concept here, I think that Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb needs to be required reading.
Yes.
I'll leave it at that. But if we want to dive into this example in particular, maybe we start with that point number 1, right? Appreciating the difference between fat as a fuel source and carbohydrates as a fuel source. What are the big differentiators? And is there anything there that you see people consistently getting just wrong when they talk about those 2 items?
Yeah, the biggest thing most people get wrong is they pick one or the other, and the answer is both, right? I mean, you just look around the fitness world. It's like, oh, it's Keto Carl has his whole thing where he's just the keto man, and maybe if you're trying to treat certain pathologies under the care of your physician, there's definitely a whole time and a place for a ketogenic approach. I mean, for the Carrick Institute, I'm an associate professor there. I wrote a whole advanced training for physicians and doctors and chiropractors about if you have TBI symptoms you're treating with patients, then a ketogenic approach might be very, very useful. But if you're the average person walking around, it can work, but you've just kind of limited yourself to one macronutrient. And then you've got other people that are, tend to be more old school endurance folks. They're like, no, it's just carbohydrate, and the Gatorade Institute shows all this performance with carbohydrates. And yes, that's true. But I've seen some metabolic heart data on some of them where they didn't even have a single crossover period. Like they can't downregulate to use fat to save their life, which I think is potentially hurting their performance, and it's definitely hurting their health. So you want carbohydrates in general for higher level intensity and higher levels of performance. That could be, doing crazy intervals on the concept too, but it also could be even a long race where there's a speed and power component. So years ago, I volunteered for the RAM race across America. We're on a 4-person team. And I thought, oh, wow, the use of carbohydrates, probably not that much. You're trying to pedal a bike from friggin' San Diego to Atlantic City. But then you realize that there's no drafting, and they have these things called hills and stuff. And so, in the middle of the race, if you want to pass someone, you got to drop the hammer and get by them, because you can't just, hang out and draft behind them. So even in something like that, where it's a very long race, there are these interspersed moments where you want the ability to use carbohydrates. On the other end, on the use of fat is primarily lower intensity, or I'd even argue resting metabolic rate, walking, NEAT. All those activities are much better fueled by fat. You get a lot more ATP, and most people also want to perform better and get leaner. So if you're not able to use fat efficiently as a fuel, yes, can you do crazy stuff and cut your calories low enough? Will you lose weight? You will. But in my experience, you just feel pretty horrible doing it. Where if you can use fat really well as a fuel, doing a 12-hour fast or skipping a meal here and there, or doing those things that allow you to be in a caloric deficit, it's just a lot easier. So you'd want to try to set the system up and rig it in your favor, and not just feel like you have to, more gonadal fortitude and just white knuckle your way through everything.
Yeah, I love that. What would be some specific ways that people could approach training those two systems separately.
Mm-hmm.
Like if somebody wanted to come in and be like, man, I really want to improve my ability to utilize this fat pathway. And likely there's someone out there who's like, man, maybe I really want to improve my ability to utilize this carbohydrate pathway. What are some actual just tactics people can use to approach improving those two worlds?
So for fat, the main hormone for both of them is going to be insulin. So insulin is, to steal Jeff Volek's stuff, is more of a fuel selector switch. When insulin levels are low, it's going to push your body to use more fats. When insulin levels are high, it's going to push your body to use more carbohydrates. And the cool part is that insulin is under a fair amount of dietary control, primarily based on, maybe some protein. Carbohydrates will definitely push up insulin. You can do shots of olive oil till the cows come home, and there's going to be no effect on your insulin. So to upregulate the use of fat, I like people to work up to a longer period of fasting. Take 6 to sometimes even 8 weeks to work up to one 19 to 24-hour fast once per week. It's normally done on an off day or a light training day to start. And then, as much as it gets a whole bunch of shit in the fitness world, like I actually like fasted cardio, which people are like, wow, what are you talking about? No, it's not the thing that's going to rip body fat off you in like 7 days, but you want the ability to do lower intensity work in a low insulin environment, which by definition is primarily going to be fasted. It's lower to moderate intensity, so you don't need carbohydrates to really do it. You're not pushing performance. So I'll have people do that usually first thing in the morning. If they don't have a heart rate strap or anything for intensity, I'll have them breathe through their nose, which is going to cap high intensity for most people, unless they're pretty advanced. And then on the carbohydrate end, doing some type of weight training, higher intensity intervals. I'm a big fan of the assault bike and the rower, as you know, because you get actual data from it. And we can argue if some of the assault bikes are 100% correct with the data they spit out. But to you as a person, it doesn't matter, right? Because you're just baselining it against yourself. And you can do, 30, 60-second wind gates if you really want to just torture yourself. But even like a 500 meter on a Concept 2 rower, that's pretty high intensity. You get power output, you get time, you can set up all sorts of heinous repeats and intervals. But the key is you want to maintain the quality of the output. So when people do intervals, I'm a big fan of having them start out with, okay, we're going to do 30 seconds at, 400 watts. And then I'll leave the rest period open-ended. So rest as much as you need to. Now your goal is I want to see you hit 30 seconds within maybe even 5% of that output again. Rest as much as you need to. Okay, now do it again. And once you can do that for 5, 7, 8 intervals, whatever you want, then maybe we'll start to compress the rest period. But again, I don't want to see the quality actually suffer. And on the high end of that, which I stole from my buddy Dr. Kenneth J, is if you can do at a high output 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off for 10 rounds and not see a drop in power, that's pretty damn badass. And if you've ever tried it, it's absolutely freaking
it's the worst.
Hideous.
It is the absolute worst. When we used to run the Silverback Training project back in the day when I was in grad school, just trying to figure out how to do some stuff I really enjoyed and to also supplement my very meager grad student research stipend. There was a phase of training in Silverback where they had to do 30-30 repeats.
Oof.
And that was a 6-month program. And I can tell you there is some nastiness in that program over the course of the 6 months. Unanimously, across the board, every single person that went through that program was like, that was the worst thing I have ever done. And it is the worst thing in this program. It was just like, I remember the first day we had guys running that because we had a Slack forum going for everybody that was doing it. Everyone's just like posting pictures of like, I vomited everywhere. We probably had like a 70% vomit rate. But that's because they actually put out on it. I see other people talk about doing 30-30s and on like an assault bike for 10 rounds. It's like, oh, it wasn't that bad. I'm like, you just didn't try. You didn't try that hard. It's like, if you actually try hard on that, there's no chance you don't collapse off the bike. 0%. Like, this is what it is.
No.
But I like the fasting example because that's something that I've done for myself for a little while now, is I usually will try to treat Sundays as a day where I can do a longer, more extended fast, because it's the one day of the week I'm probably not going to really train or do anything like that, or just my demand, right? My demand is quite low on that day. And so it's a day that I feel comfortable just pushing off and not having anything until dinner.
Mm-hmm.
It's also nice just like taking a break and not having to eat food all day.
Yeah, you get a lot of time
I
back.
generally don't really love. Yeah, I generally just like don't like eating that much. And so I have found that is a pretty successful way of bringing that in and finding a balance in the nutrition plan to where like you're well fueled enough on days that you train. And then on a day like a Sunday where you're totally off, just chilling, maybe watching football because football season's coming up here, maybe you just don't eat until dinner at 7:00. And it gives you a nice kind of rhythm and balance to things, right? And again, where we're kind of bumping out the variability, the flexibility of the system to utilize fats, to utilize carbs. And the last bit that I was going to say here is I very much enjoyed the fasting cardio bit. I actually feel if I go do a low intensity run, I actually feel significantly worse if I do it having eaten carbohydrates. Something I've realized here over the last like 3 to 4 weeks. It feels, and my performance is frankly better also. Like if I go out for a 3 to 5 mile run, it's vastly better if I go fasted than if I go later in the day and I have been eating a lot of food and I've been eating a higher amount of carbs, or I have kind of like a big Gatorade thing before I go. I'm worse. And there's something I've noticed over the past 3 to 4 weeks that I thought was pretty interesting.
Do you get any like weird GI upset, or does your stomach feel kind of heavy, or what do you feel? That's usually the complaint.
So, yeah, like one, it's just I don't feel as light and smooth and easy. And then two, yeah, I get the GI distress. Like I'll get like a mile into my run and be like, I have to poop. Which is a horrendous
not the
feeling.
best
It's
for
not fun at all.
Yeah, look, there's trees.
No, so yeah, like I'm scouting out. I'm like, all right, I'm in a pretty populated area here. Like, where if I've got to pull the plug and this turns into an emergency, like where am I going?
Do you wear a fanny pack with a little extra TP just in case there?
Oh man, no, I've not gone that far yet. But if we, okay, so as we kind of zoom ourselves back out here, I went on a little tirade there. So from a tactical standpoint, we have maybe taking 1 day a week and pushing out and building up a tolerance for fasting. Like maybe you start with a 6-hour fast, you just fast until lunch. Then maybe we fast until the afternoon. Then maybe we fast until 6 or 7 o'clock at night. Some low intensity fasted cardio there can be great on a bike, on a rower, running if you can do that and that floats your boat. And then on the carbohydrate side, we obviously have our traditional weightlifting, right? Like if you're going to do a bodybuilding-esque higher volume training day, that is going to be a big carbohydrate glycogen based event. And then you can do your higher intensity intervals again on the same tools, on a bike, on a rower, etc., to try to force yourself to utilize more carbs. And the other bit there I think that was important is regards to appreciating the insulin environment is going to help kind of turn the dial a little bit to which fuel source you're probably going to preferentially want to use.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And if you think about it at a really basic level, you want to use carbs for performance, and we want, even in just the average gym rat, you want to drive performance because that's your stimulus for adding muscle, adding strength, and even just motivation to train. Like nobody wants to go to the gym and see their performance get worse, right? I mean, this is not that motivating. And we did an experiment with one of my clients, shout out to Ryan Baxter, where he was at, I think, a baseline of like 300 grams of carbs. And then before his bigger rowing days, we bumped him up and this is in the past, to 400. So we had another 100 grams of carbs. And he was not like a low carb person at all. And we did this a couple times where we did different amounts, 300 or 400. And bumping him up to 400 resulted in 50 more watts when he did the rower, which is very significant. And his RPE felt almost the same, right? So it's going to vary per person, but just having enough fuel will allow that better performance. And then those days you're doing, like the template I use for a lot is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, maybe Saturday, depending on their goals, some type of lifting, some type of interval training. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday is kind of a mixed day sometimes, or Sunday, do some more moderate intensity cardio. If you want to add some fasted cardio in the morning, that's fine too. But just think about what is the goal of that particular session, and what are you actually trying to do? Like, what adaptations do you want? And I think in the fitness world, we're pretty good with that with strength training, but we forget of the interaction between nutrition and training. And so I've seen some pretty good programs on nutrition and some pretty good programs on nutrition and then training. But when the people bring them to me, they're like, oh yeah, the nutritionist did this and my strength coach did this. And you put them together and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Like on their own, they kind of make sense, right? But you're a human, like you're doing both of these and you just overlay these two without any rhyme or reason to what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, for sure. And then the third, I think, variable you mentioned is your capacity to, how quickly can you switch between the two, right? How do you like to actually approach that? Is it just getting exposure to the different types of training and stressors and inputs we've talked about so far? Or are there more specific things you'd like to do to try to see how rapidly can the body actually flip from one to the other and kind of like turn the dial, if you will?
Yeah, so if I go all the way up to like a 50,000 foot view, I have this obsession with principles and what principles work. And to me, the definition of a principle is something that can be applied across various systems and still be held true. And one of them is, I think you're much better off if you can do a fast transition versus a slow transition. If we look at 100-meter sprinters, like who wins? The person with the fastest transition, right? The person who crossed the line first. You look at NFL season is coming up, like who are probably some of the best athletes? The ones who can run fast and change direction very fast. If you go drag racing, what's the car that wins? The one that can accelerate and make it across the line first. So it's very similar with nutrition. Can you do a fast transition from a higher carb environment to a lower carb environment would be one. Can you go from, let's say, Monday you're at 450 grams of carbs and maybe Tuesday is a fasting day. So Tuesday might literally be, for a 24-hour period, 0 carbohydrates. And if you feel like poo and you sleep all day, then you probably are not doing so well with that. Or the other end, you can do the old school, what I call the 2 Pop-Tart test. If you have 2 Pop-Tarts for breakfast and you feel like you're going to take a nap under your desk the rest of the day, and your blood glucose, if we measure it, is 200, yeah, going from 0 to 80 grams of carbohydrates isn't very good. Right? So formally we call that an oral glucose tolerance test. And then we can measure how fast you come back to baseline. We can look at heart rate. Heart rate is the same thing, heart rate recovery. If you can go to a high heart rate and come back faster, you have a more developed parasympathetic system, you're going to be more robust. So it's kind of the same ideas, and you can set up different, I would say, challenges with that. So on the two ends of the spectrum, can you do kind of a hard transition into a longer fast? And can you do the opposite? Can you do from maybe an overnight fast to, say, like the 2 Pop-Tart challenge test, and just kind of, go about your day after that? Now, again, this doesn't mean that people need to eat Pop-Tarts every day for breakfast, because they send me all sorts of hate mail about that. But if you want to take the end of a spectrum of 80 grams of carbohydrates that are dirt cheap, that are probably nuclear proof, where the frosting doesn't even melt when you put it in the toaster, which is some form of ceramic I think NASA's investigating, that's probably the most extreme right end of the spectrum you can get. And if you can handle that on occasion, I've often joked that metabolic flexibility is like, you want to be more like a cockroach, right? And in fitness, everybody's like, oh, I got to make sure everything's perfect. It's like, yeah, do good things by all means, but at some point you want to stress the system a little bit and make sure you're okay, right? We can adopt cockroaches into all sorts of environments and they seem to do well. So you kind of want to be like the human cockroach of nutrition.
I love it. I'm considering making that the title of this episode. How to be the human cockroach with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Yeah. I think it'll play really well.
And people laugh at it too, but I did a presentation for DARPA, going back 10 years ago now, I think. So DARPA is the, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And they were looking at, nutrition for elite level soldiers and a bunch of other stuff that's still classified. But my argument was, okay, if you're going to send like a small group of elite people out to the middle of a country in no man's land, one of your biggest risks is, as that scales up, is all of the infrastructure that it takes to support them. So if you can train them ahead of time to get by on less things, do some fasting, eat locally, whatever, but you have to train them ahead of time so they know that they can perform in those circumstances, you're going to be much better off. And the reality is, like, people who do special forces stuff have known this for years, so it wasn't like it's a real big secret. But it was trying to get more of the military on that wavelength, and it went over pretty good. But there's a couple old people in the back who still didn't quite grasp the concept. So even on the elite level, it's still applied, and I think still useful. The caveat is, just like all things, you have to train for it. Like, the worst possible thing is if you're used to eating, every 2 hours, and your performance is dependent upon that, and now you get dropped into an environment where you can't eat for 24 hours, mentally that's very unnerving, right? But if you've practiced for it and you've done a 48-hour fast, you've hit all your targets, like, you can do all the things that you could normally do. You're like, yeah, okay, cool, I'm fine. Like, I'm not, I'm not worried about it. I've already done this.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And just a quick note on the rate or the velocity comment from earlier. I think that you see that very well in the kinetics literature.
Yes.
As well. And so in the kinetics literature, it's referred to as a tau value, which is basically how fast you move between different metabolic rates, right? You look at somebody who is, on a bike pedaling or maybe resting, like they could be sitting in the chair resting, and then they're going to be at some wattage, or they're at some low wattage, and then you move them to some high wattage, whatever it is. And you want to see what that transition period looks like from metabolic rate A up to metabolic rate B. And that transition period is incredibly important. And what you see if you dig into that literature is that the highest performing, healthiest, most robust humans have the fastest transitions.
Yep.
Pretty much unanimously across the board, right? They have the smallest tau value. And when you start seeing aging, disease, and other factors, that transition gets really, really slow. So the line is less vertical and it gets pushed flatter. It takes them a long time to transition from demand A to get to new demand B. And so, again, I think it's just, right, you want to pay attention to things that tend to pop up across different avenues, right? And that's definitely one of them. Totally agree.
Yeah, and I think someone wrote this blog post. I give him credit, but I can't remember who it was. But he called it the porcelain doll diet. And his whole argument was exactly what we're talking about. Like, if you have everything quote unquote perfect, yeah, that works good, but until it's not perfect, and then what happens? Like, all your wheels, completely fall off. And the reality is, you can train for some of that ahead of time. And you're injecting this variability, these transitions back into you as a physiologic organism. And not only are you going to get better results and be healthier, the reality is it's actually easier, right? I mean, the amount of people I've had, get used to doing a fast, and when they travel, they're like, oh yeah, I just didn't eat for 14 hours and it was so much easier. Yeah, great. They prepared for it, so they were ready. Yeah, so I think you can do training ahead of time and be more prepared for it and actually make your life a little bit easier and actually get better results at the same time.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement. I think that to try to zoom people out on this, the way that we like to approach this at Rebel, when we bring people on board to work with them, we kind of view it as like a level 1, level 2 thing. And we want you to be very proficient. Sorry, let me use my words better here. We want you to be very proficient at level 1 items first before we worry about taking you to level 2 items, right? Are you doing all of the basics incredibly well already, right? Because like we get so many people who come in like, I want to lose weight, I want to gain weight, I want this, I want that. And so many of the basics are just not there with regards to like eating enough calories, eating the right amounts of food, eating a good split of macronutrients, eating at the right frequency. We're just missing the basics entirely. So for people listening to this, I would still highly, highly, highly encourage you to get really good at the basics first. Once you get good at the basics, this is the level 2 conversation of how do we tweak and change the baseline plan to become more advanced and to take things kind of that next level. that's at least how we like to approach it. I'm not sure if you would make a similar recommendation to folks, like get good at the basics first, and then let's start, playing with the variables and jacking up the metabolic flexibility, because I know you're at least in a position to be able to handle these things well.
Yeah, and that's so when I was setting up the Flex Diet Cert, that was one of the biggest questions I was trying to resolve in my head, right? Was by all means, you have some people's nutrition that looks like a floating trash bin fire, and they would just do better to eat something that's green, that's not a green Skittle, and for God's sake, just have some protein and go to bed, right? But how do you set those things up so that they're working on the big principles and adding variability into the system at the same time? So what I did is I set it up so that you are definitely going to cover all of the basics as you go through, but you're adding them in a way that you're also adding a variability to the system at the same time. So what I did is I kind of merged them together. So for example, like the first intervention is focusing on more protein. It's pretty easy to give recommendations on protein. There's lots of good reasons for it. But the second intervention actually ends up being intermittent fasting because of the benefits to the metabolic system, and it's relatively easy for people to do if they follow in a stepwise fashion. And that actually injects a lot of variability into the upregulation of fat. If you look at the literature, even on relatively obese people, the two process, so you have to break these triglycerides, so 3 of them stuffed on a glycerol backbone. You have to break them in a process called lipolysis, and then you actually have to burn them for fuel. You can break a whole bunch of them apart, but if you don't burn them for fuel or fatty acid oxidation, they just get reesterified and they just go back together again. So obese people, they've done some very cool research back in the 80s and 90s where lipolysis wasn't a rate limiter. Like they were liberating more fat than what they could use, but it was their ability to use the fat itself. Turns out fasting worked pretty good when combined with a little bit of exercise to have lipolysis and then to actually use more of the fatty acids. So not only are you getting better body composition from it, you're upregulating the body's ability to use fat as a fuel, and I think it's a lifestyle that transfers and gives you the option in different environments. So I think you can definitely cover the basics, and then you can kind of inject this variability along the way as you're going through the process.
I like it. That checks out. That makes a lot of sense to me. I like that combo. That 1-2 punch I think is very good. Mike T, let's do this. For people that would like to find you, because I could sit here and talk to you for the rest of the day about this stuff.
Oh yeah, this is fun.
But yeah, no, this is fantastic. But the calendar and the clock is calling here. So let's wrap this up. But where can people go to find you, all the incredible work that you're doing, learn a little bit more about this whole metabolic flexibility thing?
Yeah, so the best place is just probably the main website, which is miketnelson.com. And if you go on there, there's a couple different opt-ins to get onto the newsletter. Most information we have will go out via the newsletter. So just pick one of those and drop me a note through the newsletter. Tell me you heard me on this fun podcast, and I'll send you a cool free gift.
All right. I like it. That's a good way to do it. Well, Mike T, thank you so much for coming on, my friend. Always a pleasure.
Yeah,
this was a blast.
Thank you so much. This was fun. Good to see you again.
You as well.